Hi, welcome to NSU's Shark Chats. My name is Chris Guanche, and I'm a digital media specialist in the College of Psychology. And for today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Glenn Scheyd, who is the chair of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the College of Psychology, where you'll find programs such as behavioral neuroscience, experimental psychology, and more. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So before we get into our topic, why don't you tell me a little bit about your professional background and your research interests?
Sure. So my area and my background is in the field of evolutionary psychology. So for those not familiar with it, it's essentially it's evolutionary biology, but with a specialization on human behavior. And so I had sort of cross-disciplinary training in my doctoral program at University of New Mexico in psychology, in biology, and anthropology as well. And so the field of evolutionary psychology is basically an attempt to understand human nature, to understand the way that humans behave as being a product of past processes of natural selection, as opposed to what a lot of people in the social sciences look at, which is what's going on in the immediate environment or what's gone on during the person's own lifetime to influence their tendencies and dispositions.
So we're going to talk today about altruism, and I figured to start, we can just establish as a baseline sort of what the lay understanding of what altruism is, and then get into it from an evolutionary psychology perspective.
Okay.
So what would you say is the common understanding of altruism?
I think basically just making sacrifices of oneself. So doing anything that is to your own detriment in order to benefit somebody else, I'd say is the general conception of altruism.
Mm-hmm. So from an evolutionary biology or psychology standpoint, where does altruism come from? How did it come into being?
So it's been fashioned at least a couple of different times, and depending on which evolutionary psychologist you talk about, there may be another one that's debatable. But the most widespread form of altruism that we see is just the tendency to care for one's offspring specifically, but tendency to care for one's family members and close relatives more than for complete strangers. So the sort of negative way of looking at that is to call it nepotism, but it is in fact, you see parents all the time making huge sacrifices of themselves for the benefit of their children, and more generally people making sacrifices for members of their family. And that one's sort of the easiest to explain from an evolutionary perspective once you realize that the sort of the ground level currency that evolution operates upon is genetic success. And if you're helping out your offspring, when you're doing that, you're helping out other copies of your own genes that just happen to be inside someone else's body.
Are we talking like in a like the deep history of humanity, say a hunter-gatherer putting themselves at risk to defend their family or their tribe from, say, some wild beast?
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back far further into the past than just human evolutionary history. You see the same thing in many other species of animals as well. So it's something that's been consistently favored. As long as it's benefiting the genes, it can be detrimental to the one individual organism that's performing the behavior. So it's altruism from one perspective. It's just genes selfishly helping themselves out wherever those genes happen to be from another perspective. But from the perspective of an outsider looking at one organism doing something for another organism, it certainly appears to be altruism. And then a second one is what's referred to as reciprocal altruism. And that's just, for other situations where it's not between family members, but it can be between colleagues or friends or members of a tribe or something like that. The tendency to make sacrifices for another individual who will in turn repay that favor at some point. And over years or decades, you're both going to be much better off in the long run if you have each other to rely on and help out when you're in desperate situations, than you would be if each of you just decided, I'm going to go it alone. There's, from one perspective, it seems like that just sort of cancels out in the long run, and you're not any better or worse off than you would be if you never shared anything and never took anything. But the way that resources map onto utility or tendency to survive, there's this sort of like negatively accelerated utility curve. So like the more food you have, the less important it is to have one more bite of food, or the more money you have, the less important it is to have one more dollar. And so if you can help people out when it's a time of surplus for you, and they can help you out when it's a time of surplus for them, then you will both be better off. So that's reciprocal altruism. And again, it's not something that's only seen in humans. We see vampire bats do this. It's sort of a classic example. They go out, fly around, and if they have a successful hunt and they gorge themselves on blood, that's a good night for them. But if you have several successive nights of failure on the hunt, then you could starve to death. They share blood when they get back to the cave, share with their friends, and repay the favor later on. The specific behavior is sort of disgusting regurgitation of blood, but they're sharing food with each other.
What would be some kind of similar examples, say in primates, you might point to of reciprocal altruism?
Well, probably my favorite example, if I assume you're talking about non-human primates.
Yes.
There's this entire book by Franz de Waal, is a primatologist. It's called Chimpanzee Politics, and he has written this. It's a true story, just the saga of following these chimpanzees for a number of years and watching this one alpha male who was just accustomed to getting the usual like deferential bowing and scraping gesture that the other males do in his presence. And then one day, this younger one stood up to him in this very defiant way. And there was clearly going to be some sort of conflict emerging. And there was, in fact, the younger one ended up replacing the older one in the status hierarchy. I'm hoping I remember the names correctly. So the original alpha male was Jeroen, and then the younger one was Louis, who replaced him. And then there's one called Nikki that Jeroen ended up forming an alliance with. And through that alliance, they collectively were able to replace the one alpha male who had just recently placed himself in there. But he goes into all sorts of details about how they're assisting each other in the process of plotting the overthrow of the new king, so to speak. And also just side stories of ways that they were using tools to assist each other in trying to escape from the enclosure where they were being observed and things like that that just happen along the way. But the main story arc is just the rise and fall of the alpha males in the group. So that's the first example that comes to mind.
So going from ancient history and non-human primates, where does that take us to now, where humanity is evolutionarily talking about altruism?
Well, so I guess the point that I'd emphasize there is that the human mind hasn't really changed all that much over the past 100,000 years. It certainly hasn't changed very much over the past 10,000 years, but we have all sorts of new technologies. We got much larger conglomerations of humans living together. So instead of living in a hunter-gatherer tribe of maybe 200 people, now we live in a metropolitan area of, I don't know how many people are in this metropolitan area, 6 million or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's dramatically different environment, but we have the same cognitive architecture and software that we're running, and we're evolved with sort of a morality that was very well suited for ancestral environments, and not necessarily suited that well for the modern environment, and certainly wasn't designed by evolution in order to maximize net human happiness. It's just whatever happened to work to propagate the genes, and so we did evolve. It's nice that we have some sort of morality and ethical code, but it's not a code that seeks to use the greatest tools in terms of rationality and deductive reasoning and mathematical modeling and things to try to figure out what is going to maximize the total satisfaction of conscious entities on the planet from now to, you know, an infinite future. It's just sort of like what works well to keep me safe and to protect my in-group and to form alliances. And, you know, that's better than nothing, but it's not designed to maximize human happiness or let alone the happiness of all sentient beings.
So kind of like if you were trying to do modern computing tasks on a machine running Windows 3.1.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, there's also just an analogy within human psychology, which is we have this intuitive physics. So you can do a very good job calculating the trajectory of a baseball that's flying towards you and catch it successfully. Many people of average intelligence are perfectly capable of doing that while it's on the fly, literally. And the mathematics is fairly complicated, but we're evolved to be able to detect the trajectories of things that are moving towards us in order to be able to catch them, in order to be able to jump out of the way. And so we have a good concept of the physics of how things rise and fall and can be flung a certain distance with a certain amount of force. But that's all within a relatively narrow range. So we can tell, you know, something that's the size of a rock that can fit in our hand, how that's going to fly if we hurl it as hard as we can at a certain angle. We're pretty good at detecting, you know, like what's going to happen for anything that's maybe between the size of a pebble and the size of a tree or something like that. But it tells us nothing about what to expect when it comes to, like, you know, the behaviors of galaxies or the behaviors of quarks and, you know, quantum mechanics and so forth. And so when people read about this stuff, they're like, that can't possibly be true, because I know how stuff moves and how it works, and you're saying these two things are in the same place or different places at the same time, and that's not possible. It's like, well, it's not possible for a human, but you know, we never perceive things at that scale ancestrally, and so we didn't evolve to be able to intuit any of that stuff, and likewise, we didn't evolve to be able to intuit what's going to contribute to the suffering of billions of people on the planet. We're more evolved to figure out what's going to be good for my family, what's going to be good for my tribe, what's going to be good for me.
So on that note of larger scale, kind of more abstract issues, tell me about existential risks.
So a lot of the people working today in a field called effective altruism are focused largely on existential risk. The idea being that if we get one of these things wrong, that it could spell the end of all humanity, or maybe the end of all life on Earth. If we have something go disastrously wrong with respect to nuclear weapons or artificial intelligence that is misaligned with our own desires and values, pandemics potentially, but pandemics sort of pale in comparison to how bad some of these things can be if you're imagining the worst case scenarios of what AI could lead to. If you've seen the Terminator movies, for instance, that'll give you an idea. And so the idea is basically, for any one of these things, maybe there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that things are really going to be that worst case scenario. But there are like 7 or 8 different major existential risks that people are focused on out there. Climate change, another of them that can have cascading effects that are much worse than what people just sort of intuitively think, which is things are going to be hotter, it's going to be very uncomfortable, and maybe it remains hot permanently, and ice caps melt and polar bears go extinct, and we have a little bit harder time growing crops. But it can get a lot worse than just that, potentially. So anyway, with these 7 or 8 different existential risks, even if any particular one of them has only a 1 in 1,000 chance of happening, and that's an underestimate, I'd say, with the AI one and with the nuclear weapon one, and with climate change. You have to multiply that level of risk times the magnitude of what the effect would be. And if you do the math there, and you see like, this is a much bigger problem for us to focus on than the particular political issues of the day that people think this is the essential thing that we need to be fighting about right now. This is terrible that people on the other side of the aisle are opposed to this particular change. And there are some important issues there, but they're not important on the scale of, something that could wipe out life on Earth. So again, these are things that people wouldn't have had to think about ancestrally. These are risks that pretty much didn't exist except for the rise of modern technology and modern environments. But since we're in that position now, it's good that we have a lot of smart people trying to think about what could potentially happen and ways to prevent those things from happening.
So as people like to jokingly say, how do we get our lizard brains to kind of process or understand or make more relatable these abstract, distant issues like, say, climate change or an asteroid slamming into the Earth? How do you make something unrelatable relatable to someone from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the best at doing this, but I've seen people who just do a spectacularly good job of it in the format of a podcast or a TED Talk or just writing a popular science book. That at least for the audiences that seek out those media, I think it's been very effective at communicating those messages and the urgency of those existential risks. But that's not most people. Most people are not particularly interested in seeking that out. Most people, again, it's like if you try to explain quantum mechanics to like any human, it's like that doesn't make sense. You're a lunatic if you believe this stuff is true. And so unfortunately, yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of the camp that most people would be in. If they were exposed to these ideas at all, they would just say that's not true. This guy is just being paranoid and doesn't know what he's talking about. And maybe has some fancy degree, but what does that mean? If this guy's spouting nonsense, he's not somebody I'm going to listen to. So, I mean, I wish it were easier to do that, and maybe that's an area that people are focusing on. I'm just not familiar with like the research on how to maximize the effectiveness of messages. I mean, there's a lot of social psychology research on that in general, on the effectiveness of different techniques of persuasion, but I'm not familiar with that being applied specifically to convincing the world or convincing the majority of people that we need to focus more on these really hyper urgent issues, or at least issues of enormous magnitude, whether it's urgent in the sense that it's an immediate threat. But I presume there are smart people working on these things. I certainly hope so. It's not something that I'm working on myself. But when the topics come up, I'm happy to talk about them and, persuade people who aren't, who are like interested in the idea of AI being a potential threat to the future of humanity, but don't know whether or not that's something to take seriously. That you probably should take that seriously. But there are a number of these risks out there. So just if you ignore all of them, sooner or later something's going to wipe out our species, at least, if not everything on the planet.
You had mentioned effective altruism earlier, so why don't we dive a little bit more into that, of what that field of thought is about, and what, for instance, would be some examples of utilizing it?
Yeah. So I think people in general, although I'm sort of misanthropic at times, most people are pretty decent, and if they see suffering somewhere in the world that they can alleviate, or if they see suffering, just one sick child, and they are told, you can make a contribution to this particular organization that's doing research on this disease that can find a cure, they're happy to give what they can, to spend a little bit of money to try to assist with whatever charity is near and dear to their heart, at least. And so it's nice. People are not quite as selfish as one might have predicted. If you just saw how humans were behaving thousands of years ago, we are generally moving towards sort of more civil societies, I think, in spite of what you would see as sort of the front page news from day to day. And yeah, so many people are voluntarily contributing money themselves altruistically to help out others, but they're more influenced by just whatever happens to tug at their heartstrings than by like trying to reduce suffering as much as they possibly can, given that this is the amount of money that they're available to contribute. And so the effective altruism movement is really saying, well, don't just rely on I want to make a contribution, and so I like this charity, I'm going to do that. When there may be another charity out there that is literally 100 or 1,000 times as effective at preventing child mortality or at reducing pain and suffering of people on the other side of the world. And so it's focused on taking sort of a mathematical approach to figuring out how best to take the resources that each individual has available to them that they can potentially contribute in order to maximize the effectiveness of those contributions of our philanthropy as a species. And so, like for instance, if you're donating, let's say $25 a month to some charity, it could be the Red Cross or St. Jude's or Habitat for Humanity or ASPCA or whatever it might be. That's great. You're improving things by doing that. But there are charities that are more and less effective than that one if the goal is that you want to just diminish suffering, let's say, or some grand utilitarian goal like that. And if you were taking that same amount of money and contributing it to the Against Malaria Foundation, which takes just 100% of the contributions and buys mosquito nets to hang over children's beds in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where there's high level of malaria transmission, then you're, for a relatively modest contribution, like for every, I don't remember exactly what the amount was, but maybe every couple $100 or something that you contribute to a cause like that, you are saving someone's life every bit as much as if you like ran into a burning building and saved the child and brought them out there and that person got to live for another 80 years because of your sacrifice of running into the building. So in terms of outcomes, you're getting a just tremendous bang for your buck by contributing to an organization like that. And we don't want everybody to just contribute all their resources to that and ignore research on cancer and ignore prevention of cruelty to animals and ignore providing homes for the homeless and so forth. But if we just generally shift people's attitudes towards recognizing that if you look into it, there are people who are doing the research for you and they can show you all the data and how they did the calculations to show how effective each of these different charities are. Then just in general, the fact that there are people doing that work and sort of popularizing the fact that that's going on, I think has the effect of making the world a better place relative to what it would be if people were just, whenever they feel like they have something to contribute, they contribute to something that feels like it's probably doing good deeds.
So in terms of the altruism, though, in your example, like say you donate X amount of money to combat malaria in some other country, and it turns out that yes, your donation is saving X amount of lives. Isn't there then the challenge of understanding that you're doing that when you're never going to see these people, you're never going to meet these people, versus, like you said, running into a burning building and saving someone who presumably thank you, and you see the immediate impact?
Yes. So I guess that gets back to sort of the main topic here, which is we did not evolve to perceive the suffering of people on the other side of the planet. We evolved to perceive, like, this baby is crying, this baby needs to be fed, or it's cold and needs to be held and comforted and things like that. So we're very good at responding to those things. But not evolved to respond to, text on a screen that informs us about the number of people who are suffering of this particular condition in this other country that you've never been to and maybe couldn't locate on a map. And so, yeah, we have to overcome just the natural limitations that people have cognitively and socially based on what we've evolved to relate to in our morality and understanding of ethics, that we can do a better job than just relying on common sense or common morality, and should, because I think maybe the most important lesson to convey to people, if you could just convince them of one thing, is that just reducing the total amount of suffering that is happening in the world, that is a good foundation for morality. And if you can shift it from wherever they are at some other point to that, if like reducing suffering is a good thing, then people would be more concerned about the suffering of people in other countries. They'd be more concerned about the suffering of animals under conditions of factory farming as well, and not focused as much on like, well, what can we do that's good for our group, where one of the unfortunate things about these contributions is that people they'll donate $25 to collection plate when they go to a church, and feel like I've done a lot to make the world a better place, and maybe some of that money gets funneled into some charitable work that their particular church is doing, or maybe not. Maybe some of it just goes to the pastor, some of it goes to paying the electric bill and the AC for the church, and some of it goes to marketing to bring more people into the church so they can get more contributions. And if the person making that contribution feels like, now I've done my part, then that's going to prevent them from doing something that could have actually had a much greater effect on the world, which is what they wanted to do in the first place. I think that they're genuinely interested in helping out, but just my goal would be to try to get people to focus on just like what is going to be effective at reducing suffering wherever it's taking place. That's at least my sort of moral foundation. And I think the more people can adopt that, the more we can reduce suffering, which should be a goal in and of itself.
So it sounds like utilitarianism is a major part of this concept of effective altruism.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there are different camps within the effective altruism movement, but generally, yeah. I mean, if you pose the question to any two people who identify themselves as a part of the effective altruism movement, and ask them, what, like a trolley problem, what's better, do whatever action that causes the death of 3 people or do this other action that causes the death of 1 person, they would say the death of 1 person is maybe regrettable, but it's better than the death of 3 people. And right. So yeah, it's focused on that. Whereas for most people, we give them the form of the trolley problem, where it's you have to push somebody off the bridge in order to kill that person that you personally are pushing in order to save some larger number of other people. People are like, oh no, that doesn't feel right. And it doesn't feel right because you have these evolved adaptations for like not going out and causing other people to die. And it's good that you have that, but you should recognize that there's a larger goal, which is just like the total number of people who die. That's an important thing to consider. And I wanted to mention Paul Bloom's book also, Against Empathy, where he gives examples of how, if you have a commercial where they're seeking contributions and they focus on this one like sad looking child who's suffering of leukemia or whatever the case may be, and then you ask people to contribute, take out their credit cards and call this number and then donate at the end of the commercial, you're going to get a much bigger impact from that than if you do some presentation showing that there are like 18 million people in some country are being starved to death because this regime is in place, and you can make this contribution to try to prevent that from continuing. And people are like, 18 million people is just like, it doesn't feel like a number. So there's some, I'm going to misquote it if I try to quote it, but I think it's attributed to Stalin or something, where he says like the death of one person is a tragedy, and the death of 5 million people is a statistic or something like that. Yeah. I have at least 3 errors in the quote, but that's the general gist of it. And in fact, that's sort of how it feels emotionally to people when you see a suffering child. You feel like you'd be a terrible person to ignore that. But when you learn that millions of people are suffering, you don't feel millions of times as much sympathy toward them. You feel less total sympathy towards millions and millions of people than you feel towards just that one child. And it's, I mean, the same sorts of things that tug at people's heartstrings in, a scripted cinematic drama. It's just like the suffering of one person with a broken heart is being ignored. And man, that really gets you, because you can relate to a time when you were suffering. But read a story in the newspaper about millions and millions of people who are starving or who are being oppressed, and you may think, cognitively recognize, oh, that's terrible, I wish that wasn't going on, but you don't have the same visceral reaction to it. And the visceral reaction is what drives a lot of people's willingness to just voluntarily contribute money or other resources to try to combat suffering in the world.
Is there any new or recent research that may indicate where the study of altruism is going?
Well, I mean, it's been a large chunk of the total amount of research in evolutionary psychology for the past 15 or 20 years. And there's sort of like debates at the margins about like whether or not we should say there is, in fact, that there's been a group level process of selection for altruism among humans, and that's why humans have thrived as well as we have on the planet compared to so many other species, as opposed to just, no, it's just as a side effect of individuals benefiting that we end up seeing that most humans are altruistic, at least in the outward third-party observer sense. And I don't see those particular issues being resolved, but there's been a lot of research that sort of combines laboratory work from economics and laboratory work from ethics involving like trolley problems and different forms of that, combining that with just observations of hunter-gatherer populations and other pre-industrial populations to sort of map out the moral architecture of humans. And I think the clearer we can draw that map, the better position we'll be in to know where to pull the levers and press the buttons in order to get people on board with trying to be more effective altruists.
In terms of altruism and large-scale issues, would you say that something like the COVID pandemic is a kind of like natural experiment that a lot of researchers are or will be looking at in the long term?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a lot of that stuff underway already. It does, whenever there's some major world event, there are new important landmark studies in the social sciences, just examining like what effect has this had, and reevaluating maybe some of our old ideas of social psychology, or refining them in response to new data that we get. And so the pandemic is going to be no exception to that. We had another big pandemic 100 years ago, as I think everyone knows by now, or 101 years ago. But we didn't have as many people in the social sciences back then trying to study it and gain insight into our social psychology and our moral psychology at that point as we do today. So yeah, I'm excited to see what we can learn from this as sort of a silver lining to this whole awful mess.
And if people are interested in any of the topics that we've covered today, are there any other books or web resources that you would recommend to them?
I think what I would like to do is just recommend a couple of particular people who are good thinkers and good communicators of these ideas, and you can look them up on social media or see what they've written in blogs and so forth. So Robert Wiblin, Wiblin, is excellent at this, and I think what he really excels at is so generally these ideas appeal to sort of liberal educated elites or people who would be accused of being liberal educated elites. And he's willing to put out a lot of ideas that challenge what is just sort of assumed to be true by people in those circles, and then present the data or sort of rational argument for why they're probably wrong, even though they're well intentioned about this one particular thing. And so he has just a lot of really brilliant, unconventional ideas that I've found very attractive over the years. So Robert Wiblin, I would recommend, and Diana Fleischman, also is another evolutionary psychologist, and similar to Robert Wiblin is somebody who is willing to go against the grain of what most people are thinking, which again, people in the particular circles that I'm talking about, and it's my own circle, it's academia and in the social sciences. I think we all think we have the right idea about things, and we generally, I would agree, are liberal for the right reasons. But we are also in an echo chamber within the ivory tower, and it helps to have other people who are within that ivory tower who are just a little bit smarter than most of the rest of us, I think, is the main thing, but also just like more willing to think of ideas that are outside of what might be called the Overton window, sort of like here are the boundary of what is currently acceptable political discourse, and talk about things that are really a challenge to almost anybody, at least initially. But if you recognize like these people are really smart, hear them out here, and they have data and theory, and everything is pretty carefully thought out. It's not that they're right about everything, but they have some radical ideas that are it turns out very also insightful, and I think there's sort of my thought on both of them is that they sort of represent where educated people will be in their thinking maybe 25 years from now or 50 years from now. And if you had somebody 100 years ago who was espousing ideas about like, equal rights in terms of same-sex marriage and just having full integration of society instead of segregated schools and so forth, people would have said like, who is this crazy radical person out here? But yeah, now you'd be, considered horribly backward if you weren't on board with that stuff. And I think Rob and Diana are generally on board with things that doesn't matter how liberal or conservative you're looking at on the spectrum. Most people are like, that's not right. That seems awful. But yeah, they're
really field of inquiry, I think, benefits from people shaking the tree from time to time and challenging orthodoxy.
Yeah, and they're doing that just, I would say I don't have very positive feelings about social media in general, but because there are people out there like those two and a handful of others that I follow and always impressed by, it makes it worthwhile. So.
Great. Well, thank you for your time today. It was a great discussion, I think. And if anyone would like to learn more about the College of Psychology's many undergraduate and graduate programs, you can find that information at psychology.nova.edu. Thank you and have a good day.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.